this country is fundamentally lost. And we have a political class, a ruling class that is dangerously out of touch with millions of people out there, outside of the big cities and outside of the university towns. Brexit was supposed to solve that. It was supposed to bring people back together, and it's done the opposite. So the political rebellion that we've seen in Britain, I don't think for a second it's over.
Matt Goodwin, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Let's talk about immigration. Where are we we're in London now, but where is the UK in terms of who's coming in, where are they coming from? How's that going for you?
Yeah, well, in a word, we're in a mess. The UK has gone through a profound transition when it comes to migration. So people will remember the Brexit vote.
Right.
That was really driven by a strong desire to reduce overall levels of migration. So we had a net migration rate then at around 300,000 a year, meaning 300,000 more people were coming into the country than leaving. Now, since then, as the Conservatives have basically changed the immigration system, they liberalized it basically across the board, that net migration figure has rocketed to over 600,000 a year. And as we sit here now in late November 23, the new figures are about to come out, and the rumor is they're going to be even bigger. So basically, the key point about Britain today, people need to understand, we have much less migration from Europe, much more from sub-Saharan Africa, from Asia, Middle East. Much of that is low-skill migration, even though Boris Johnson claimed it would be high-skill. It's low-skill migration. And that means over the next 10 to 15 years, Britain is going to add, depending on what estimate you look at, Britain's probably going to add somewhere around 5 to 8 million people to its population. And that migration is going to be a lot more culturally, religiously, ethnically distinct from what we've had in the past. So Britain is on the cusp of a profound major shift in its population and demography.
Okay, so I just want to make sure that I understand this. Right. How many people live on this island? Just the island?
Around 65 million, somewhere around that, 65, 70 million.
And how many, so 65 million, and you're talking about 600,000 a year.
But don't forget, that's net migration. So we've got 600,000 more people coming in than leaving. But to give you an example, last year, we gave over 1 million visas to incoming migrant workers, right? So you've got a large number coming in, about 1 million, 1.1, 1.2, and then you've got some people leaving. Many of those will be British nationals who are just leaving the country. So we're seeing a level of churn in this country that basically we've never seen before, and it's sustained and it's very significant. And my prediction is it's going to cause considerable political turmoil over the next 10 years.
Okay, so I just trying to understand this. So the people who are leaving, why are they leaving?
Well, we don't really know. Some will be coming in on short-term visas and going. Some will be Brits heading down to Spain or Portugal or Italy, just getting out of the country altogether.
Yeah.
Others will be maybe refugees who are kind of heading back after the wars and conflicts have ended. But basically what we're seeing now, compared to, say, the 2000s or the 1990s, you remember Tony Blair and New Labour. In that kind of era, we had a net migration rate of 50,000 a year. Okay, so now we're over 600,000 a year, and you might have visited some of the big cities that we've got in Britain. Well, our second biggest city after London is Birmingham. Now, if you look at current population projections by the year 2040, which is actually not that far away, really, we're going to have immigration that will we will grow by around 10 cities the size of Birmingham by 2040. So we're going to see really substantial population change. And of course, a lot of that is also going to be, as I say, distinctive. So one of the other stats that I think people outside of Britain will find interesting is the share of Britain's population that is Muslim is 6% today. By the time we get to 2040, it's going to reach about 17%. So we're going to see more than about a threefold increase in quite a short space of time as well. So that's also going to play into these ongoing debates about migration and identity.
And when you say the UK is undergoing a cultural revolution, what do you mean by that?
Oh, I mean that basically the elite class in this country, the political media, cultural, creative class, are embracing a set of socially liberal, if not radically progressive values that are reflected in the policy making process, that are reshaping the country around large scale migration, around the imposition of things like radical gender ideology, critical race theory, that we are basically importing the same elite luxury beliefs that we can see in countries like the US, countries like Canada, and that is reflected in our education system, media, cultural institutions. So by cultural revolution, I'm talking about a permanent, profound shift in the prevailing consensus, in the cultural norms that shape the conversation about who we are. And that's what I think we're seeing at the moment.
Okay, so I'm just trying to make sure I understand this, because this is obviously very complicated and it can get very tricky very fast. So the elites are basically using wokeness as a tool, wokeness as a word we can just use as a placeholder for the suite of propositions otherwise known as critical race theory or critical social justice, etc., to to make it so that it's legal for people to come in here and immigrate here? Is that what they're doing?
So if you look at the elite graduate class who tend to dominate the House of Commons, the BBC, the cultural institutions, what we know over the last 10 years, as in America, is that the elite graduate class have basically drifted to the cultural left. In Britain, partly that was a response to Brexit, right? This group felt that their socially liberal values had been violated by the decision to leave the European Union. And so they sort of doubled down, a bit like in America. You know, people talk about the great awakening among white graduate liberals. We've seen, I think, a similar thing here in Britain, where people within the BBC, within the political parties, have basically said, you know what, I'm going to express my identity, I'm going to express my social status by projecting these luxury beliefs, by saying we should have more migration, we should have more refugees. We're not really that bothered about border security. We're not really that bothered about compensating the losers of globalization or the losers of migration. And so what you've seen since Brexit, in a strange way in Britain, and you won't notice it so much here in London, but what you've seen is basically the opposite of what the vast majority of Brexit voters wanted to see. They wanted less immigration. The elite class liberalized immigration. They wanted an economy that was less dependent on London. The elite class prioritized London's financial services. They wanted more of a voice in the institutions. The elite class actually said, we're not really going to allow you into the institutions. We're going to denigrate your group. And so through this process, what I'm arguing is you've basically got this polarization now seeping into Britain. You know, loosely a polarization that's pushing apart elite graduates with socially liberal values in the cities and the university towns. Obviously, this is not unique to Britain. And non-graduates, older voters, cultural conservatives, who are now really feeling as though their beliefs, their values, their voice are no longer represented in the system. And this is where I get nervous about where Britain is going over the next 10 years.
Okay, so before we go and talk about where Britain is going, why would they do this? Like, what is the thinking behind importing tens of millions of unskilled immigrants? Like, what they must think it's some kind of a good, or they wouldn't do it.
Well, there's a couple of things going on. So one is, on the conservative side of the spectrum, you've got a lot of Tories who are committed to a political economy that is basically wrapped around the interests of big business and their donor friends, and keeping labour cheap in order to keep profits high and in order to keep us basically anchored around a kind of financial services, London-based economy. On the left of politics, among Labour MPs, you've got all the usual status signifiers. You've got the sense of moral righteousness. You've got the projection of values that you often see among Liberals in other countries as well. But I think, look, if I'm a political scientist, so if you look at the surveys of MPs in Westminster, they all show the same thing. Both politicians on the left and the right lean further to the cultural left than the average voter, including conservatives. So the system is actually much further to the cultural left than the average voter. So even if you are a conservative, typically you're a liberal conservative like Boris Johnson. You've liberalized the system. You've said, you know what? I was elected on the campaign promise to take back control, but actually what I ended up doing was saying, I'm a bohemian liberal, I'm going to just let the whole system become much more fluid. So you've got a political class that no longer reflects the interests of voters, and you've got an economy that is basically being gutted. It's being hollowed out by big business that refuses to invest in domestic British workers, that refuses to invest in increasing productivity, in innovating, in spending money outside of London. So this is where I get really frustrated and angry about where we are in Britain, because we still have a broken political economy with a political class that isn't listening. And the only difference now is we've got more low-skilled migration than we ever have. I mean, I'll just give you one stat.
Yeah.
If you want to come into Britain on a visa as a migrant worker, you can come in on a salary as low as £23,000 a year. So you need to go for a job in some sectors that pays £23,000 a year, okay? The median salary in this country is £34,000 a year. So what I'm saying is a lot of migrants coming into Britain now are coming in to do low-skilled jobs, which should ordinarily be going to domestic Brits, but they're coming in on low-skilled positions, not earning a lot of money, are a net fiscal cost to the national economy, are often taking more resource and support from the state than they're contributing.
That's where I was going to go.
And then as a consequence, you've got a lot of people out there, particularly in London, by the way, they're saying, well, this is increasing housing costs, increasing rental costs, putting pressure on the job market, undermining culture, values, ways of life. Also, these migrant workers are more culturally distinctive, so it's undermining social trust and cohesion. And that is where I think things start to get really fragile.
Okay, so there is so much going on here. I'm just going to have to put fences around certain features of the conversation so I can focus on other. I want to put a fence around and not talk about, unless you're really hell-bent on it, London as an economic center, because there are just so many other things that populate the conversation. So before you said that the Tories are doing this for economic reasons, for reasons related to big business. In that calculus, are they factoring in the tax, the quote unquote tax, or the strain on the NHS? Are they factoring in the strain, leaving aside the social variables, cultural cohesion? If you just look at it from an economic lens,
sure,
are they? What do the numbers show? If you just look at migration, forget about social cohesion, forget about all that stuff. How is it faring economic? Although I do have to say, to be fair, in that economic calculus, if you could, without muddying the discussion too much, you really do have to take into account costs of prison, incarceration, parole systems, judicial systems. So, like, what's the reality of immigration? What's the economic reality now? Big question, I know.
No, well, there's a couple of problems with answering the question, but let me try and get a decent answer together. If you were to look at a review of the evidence on how migration has affected Britain's economy, I would typically go to an institute like the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford, really good institute.
Oh no, has it been captured ideologically?
No, it's a decent institute, and their evidence would suggest, a recent review would suggest, that overall migration it's a mixed picture, but overall migration has either contributed plus 1% to our national GDP or has taken away 1% of our national GDP. So it's a bit of a mixed picture. Now, the reason that's complex is because many of those studies are based on the impact of migration prior to Brexit, or at least prior to the government changing the migration policy. And why is that important? Well, that's important because now we have more people coming in from places like Sub-Saharan Africa, Afghanistan, Albania, Sudan, Syria, other countries like that, where we know that many of the people coming in are much more likely to be a net cost to the economy. So firstly, what I'm saying is I don't think many of the recent studies are picking that up. Secondly, they don't really go beyond looking at contribution to GDP. We don't have a conversation about GDP per capita, for example, where things get a lot more complex. And we certainly don't have a conversation about what this means for things like housing and rent in London. So to give you one stat,
Right.
Britain is currently building 180,000 homes every year, okay? And it's widely accepted we have one of the most severe housing crises in Europe. We need to be building at least, if you look at the government targets, about 300,000 homes a year just to keep up with demand from our existing people.
Okay.
Now, migration, if
Yeah.
you look at, say, a think tank like the Centre for Policy Studies, they estimate we need to build over 600,000 homes every year just to keep up with the demand from migration before you even get to houses for Brits. Okay,
Yeah.
so we have a brewing housing crisis. We have a crisis in the social housing sector, where over half of all social housing in London is now occupied by people who are not British. And we have a growing public service crisis with the National Health Service being overburdened. So the reason I say that is you can't separate the economic debate over migration from the public services and the housing debate. But to be frank, Peter, as a country, and I said this recently on Substack, that we are not actually capable of even having that conversation, because even now immigration is seen as such a taboo in Britain.
Okay, I was going to
people kind of shut that down.
Yeah, I was going to get to that, but I do want to say, from my personal experience, I am flabbergasted by how expensive housing is here. Flabbergasted.
And it's gone up considerably over the last 3 years.
Yeah, I went to a Peter Thiel lecture at Oxford, and he said that basically the cost of housing is extraordinarily high I'm summarizing obviously, due to immigration when people come in. But what it really is doing is it's taxing working class people and young people, because there's no way, even on my salary, there's no way I could, for this flat right here, I'm told would be almost $2 million. Like, are you freaking kidding me? That's insane.
Yeah. And if you look at the average deposit that you would need for a very standard small flat, studio flat in parts of London, you'd be looking at upwards of £100,000 just as a deposit to put down. So
Yeah.
before you even get to things like the rental market and so on. So we have a very serious housing crisis. Now, what's interesting about that is nobody in frontline British politics has ever yet made this really a frontline issue by saying, well, the reason one of the big reasons house prices are soaring and rents are soaring is because we have so much demand and we have very little supply. Now, the demand is often coming from either high net worth international investors in places like London, or it's simply coming from lots of low skill migrants from outside of the UK. You might know the French geographer Christophe Gouillet, who wrote a wonderful book called Twilight of the Elites. And he said, look, across Europe, this isn't just a UK story, across Europe, this is just before the yellow vest blew up in France, and he was seen as kind of the guy that predicted the yellow vest. He said the big battleground is going to be in the periphery of the big cities. It's going to be the battle between domestic, native working class voters and newcomers, migrants, who are going to compete over housing, who are going to compete over jobs and wages, and who are often going to spend their lives servicing the new elite, the new ruling class in the big cities. And I think London is obviously part of that story, but so too is Oxford and Cambridge and Manchester and Birmingham. And I think we are heading into a very serious intergenerational battle here between my students from Gen Z, who are, Zoomers born in 2004, 2005, and the baby boomers who have really prospered from the big expansion of housing in an earlier period, who have made a lot of money from their housing, and the Zoomers just cannot get onto the ladder, and now they're having to compete with much higher numbers of migrants coming from elsewhere.
Okay, so I have to tell you, as an outsider, I genuinely struggle to understand this. Let me tell you what I struggle to understand, and maybe you can help me understand it. First of all, there's a difference between legal migration and illegal migration, obviously. And I understand this is an unfair question, because how do you get the stats on illegal migration since it's illegal, right? So there's you could get the stats on the people coming into the country, but do you have any idea how many people come into the country illegally?
Sure. We have a guesstimate that there are around 1 million people in the UK here illegally that we don't quite know where they are, what they're doing.
It's totally terrifying to me.
But then we also annually we have somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 coming across on the small boats or in the back of lorries, typically coming from France, which obviously is already a safe country for them, but are nonetheless crossing, risking their lives in the channel. And this is the issue that obviously our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, can't seem to solve and get on top of, because we're signed up to various international treaties and conventions, which means that we can't actually regain control over our own borders.
Okay, so that's what I want to ask. Maybe you can make this. I'm perplexed by this, so maybe you can help make this more legible for me to understand. Why don't you just, and again, if this is such a naive question, I'm sorry for asking, but I'm genuinely curious. You're on a freaking island. Put your Navy, cordon it off. I mean, how difficult can it be? And there can't be, I don't know why don't you do that?
So it's not a daft question. The vast majority of Brits out there feel exactly the way that you do. Immigration is the third most important issue for the country. It's the first most important issue for Conservatives, which is saying something given we're also in the worst cost of living crisis for half a century.
Right.
And so if you're on the right of the spectrum, even now you're saying immigration is more important to you than the cost of living crisis. You want a resolution to that crisis.
Specifically illegal immigration is what I'm talking about. That's the thing that terrifies me.
So there are a couple of big challenges going on. One is that, as we've just recently seen in November 23, the Supreme Court of the UK has ruled that Rishi Sunak's plan for providing an active deterrent for illegal migrants by sending them to Rwanda to have their claims processed in Rwanda, a third country, the Supreme Court has ruled that that is unlawful, that those people would not be considered safe in Rwanda. So one answer to your question is we have a very complex judicial legal architecture which has prevented the government from basically exerting national sovereignty to regain control over its own borders. So the answer then is, well, leave the conventions, leave the European Convention on Human Rights, reform things like the Human Rights Act that we've got here so you can clear away those obstacles and do what you suggested, which is start putting boats in the channel, start shoring up the border. Now, why isn't that happening? Well, that's not happening, firstly, because we have a Conservative Party that is more of a liberal Conservative Party than it is a genuinely Conservative Party. And the second reason, I think, is we have what I would consider or describe as a sort of, let's say, a prevailing culture or an elite consensus that these are issues that we try to manage in a sort of centrist, managerial, responsible way. We don't want to politicize these issues, and we certainly don't want to take a very hard line on these issues. The one politician who said that we should do that, Suella Braverman, was just sacked from the British government. Now, Suella, if she were here with you, and I know her and her team well, what she would be saying to you is, if you want to regain control of Britain's borders, you leave the European Convention on Human Rights, you leave any supranational treaty or organization which prevents you from dealing with issues on your own borders, you slash legal migration, because that's also posing a particular challenge to the country, and you work much more seriously at breaking up the gangs that are based in northern France and are basically organizing this ongoing invasion. And so that's essentially where we are now. Now, the reason I'm more optimistic than some, Peter, is because I don't think the British public are actually going to put up with this for much longer. It's not just that the illegal migration makes a mockery of Brexit, which was about regaining control. I mean, every time a small boat arrives on the shores of Britain, it blows a hole in the argument that we are now a sovereign, independent, self-governing nation.
You've traded Polish plumbers for small boats from Somalia.
Well, exactly. There's that too, and 75% of the people who are crossing, by the way, are young men under the age of 30. So everybody in Europe now shares a consensus from, I would argue, Germany, France, Sweden. Firstly, that mass migration has been a complete failure.
Right.
I was in Sweden recently. I didn't meet anybody on the left or the right.
Highest rape rates in the
Yeah, highest rate firearm offences going through the roof, organised gang violence in the suburbs, much of it led by children from migrant families. And Sweden now accepts this as being a failure. Germany now accepts that migration has been a failure for different reasons. It's overturning its post-war identity as being, firmly supportive of Jewish communities. It's now got anti-Semitism in a way that it's not had since the interwar years. So what I'm getting at, Peter, is an important point. The Rwanda plan that Rishi Sunak had, which was you will not deal with this crisis unless you give migrants an active deterrent. If you come to this country, we will send you elsewhere, which is what Australia did. We will send you elsewhere for processing. When Rishi Sunak announced that plan, everyone in Europe said, oh, this is a fascist plan, this is a racist plan. But now Germany wants to do it. Now Italy wants to do it. Now Sweden wants to do it. This is where we're going. We are moving in the direction of having an active third country deterrent, because nobody in the National Crime Agency in Britain who's looked at this crisis has said you will solve this crisis by smashing the gangs. Nobody thinks you will do that. You get rid of one gang, another one pops up. It's like whack-a-mole. You get rid of one gang, there's another one. What you need is a very robust law and order response with an active deterrent. So if you're in Afghanistan or Sudan or Somalia or wherever, if you try and make it to the UK, 95% of the time, you're going to end up in Rwanda, right? That's the only way we can provide a serious active deterrent.
Matt, you...
I mean, it's crazy that we're even having this debate.
there's
7 years after Brexit. It's bonkers, right?
There's so much in there. Is it that people don't think that's a problem, or they don't think it's a problem to the extent that it's actionable?
Well, you've seen this in areas of the US. This is basically, I think it's the power of social norms. I think you have a governing class that does not want to be seen to be breaking taboos on migration and racism. That is where we are. The conversation is completely unserious in this country. If you talk about the small boats and you talk about refugees and you talk about migration, you are already in very dangerous territory.
Because they think you're on the alt-right or far
because,
right.
Yeah, because we've
extremist.
seen the expansion of social norms over the last 10, 15 years that, arguing for lower migration is tantamount to racism. Arguing for high-skilled migration is seen as being too selective, and that is problematic. Arguing that migrants
What's problematic about Australia does that?
Well, we have institutions in this country that have, I would argue, have drifted very strongly to the left over the last 10 years. I'll give you an example. We have a very popular television show here called Country File. It's on Sunday evening. Grandparents watch it with their grandkids. Usually it's, you're going on little hikes in the country, and it taps into what George Orwell once argued was central to our culture, which was a love of countryside. Recently, we had a Country File presenter hit the papers because she described the British countryside now as being racist because there were not enough people from non-white backgrounds going on hikes in the countryside because the countryside was racist. That is the level of our national debate about these issues, okay? It's utterly ridiculous. So if I were to go on the BBC tomorrow and say, okay, I think illegal migration is problematic for these 4 reasons. It makes people feel insecure. It undermines the social contract. It contributes to social distrust. It fuels polarization.
I'm positive it has some relationship to crime too.
And sure, I would still be widely attacked for voicing xenophobic, racist ideas because these are fundamentally just refugees, good people that want to live in a better place, and we should therefore just have safe and legal routes for refugees from Gaza and Somalia and Sudan.
Like Germany is taking in Gaza
and we should just allow that. But here's the thing, Peter, when they say that, they'll say, yes, but there's no upper limit to that. So what's your number? How many do you want to accept? Well, there's never an upper limit in any of that.
So I don't mean to be callous when I ask this question, but these are Sweden, Germany, UK. These are democracies. People get what they deserve. People voted in individuals that didn't take these things seriously enough. We can't have honest conversations about it. So this is what you get.
I'd spin it a different way. I would say people have been misled. The British people on immigration have consistently been misled. They are living under a Conservative government at the moment that in 2019 was very explicit. Boris Johnson said he would lower the overall numbers. The Conservative Party said people would regain control of their country. They have been misled. The Conservative Party, basically, if you want to solve this issue, needs to get out of the way. I think we need a new politics in this country, a new political movement that is much more in tune with where voters are, because the Labour Party is even more socially liberal, if not radically progressive, than the Conservatives. They have no plan for illegal migration. If the Labour Party win the next election, which is likely, they want to overturn what Rishi Sunak has been trying to do to make it harder for illegal migrants to enter the country. And they want to import a lot of the woke policies from the US. They want to give government contracts on the basis of race and ethnicity.
Right. I'm sorry about that.
So we are seeing the importing of US culture wars. We are seeing, really, I would argue, the radicalization of the elite class. And we're seeing many voters out there basically doing what Robert Putnam predicted they would do in the 2000s. They're hunkering down. They're scared. They're anxious.
Let's go back to this idea. We're on an island. The reason you can't just put your Navy around and fire on any ships that come in is because you are members of, you've signed international agreements not to. And the reason that you cannot get out of those agreements is that there's no national will?
It's because there is insufficient appetite to do so among the elite class.
Okay, let's say what percentage of people on this island are in the elite class?
I would say somewhere between 10 and 15%. And by elite class, to be clear, what I mean are politicians, lawyers, judges, BBC directors, media directors, university professors, the kind of, let's say the class that essentially shapes the national conversation and decides what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. Okay, so let's say a slightly larger class than just the elite that essentially runs government.
And okay, so they're setting the discourse and they're setting the standards for discourse to a certain extent. The Overton window is shifted in such that having you on, for example, the BBC to talk about these things, you would be publicly excoriated, or they wouldn't have you on at all.
Well, the viewers would agree with me. The BBC editors would probably, they would manage that interview very carefully. So there would be things would be applied to that interview to make sure it didn't go too off-piste. Look, you're in a country where the media landscape is rapidly fragmenting for this reason. The BBC is in crisis, not just over the Israel-Gaza issue, but is in crisis because since Brexit, it has been hemorrhaging viewers and listeners. If you live in Britain, you will wake up, and you're interested in politics, you will wake up every day and you will listen to Radio 4 Today, which sets the agenda for the day. That show has lost 2.5 million listeners since the Brexit referendum. Trust in the BBC has collapsed, and we have new channels like GB News, Talk TV. We've got YouTube shows here, very, very popular, Trigonometry. We have new magazines like Unheard. You've got magazines like Spectator and so forth, which have been around.
Named all my buddies there.
Have been around a lot longer.
Yeah.
But the key point in all this, I think, Peter, is the media landscape here is rapidly fragmenting because legacy media has done such a bad job at talking about these issues. And that's why the one cause for optimism I have in Britain is we are actually building an alternative ecosystem that is closer to the public mood.
What about, I was on BBC's Hard Talk. Would they have you on to talk about these issues?
They would, but they would, again, it would be very carefully managed. So if you were to go on a BBC show such as Newsnight, which is a popular evening show or used to be a popular evening show, and you were to discuss immigration, and let's say I were to go on and I were to say, actually, I support something like the Rwanda plan. I think we do need an active deterrent. Why? Because women and children and men are losing their lives in the busiest channel, in one of the busiest crossings in the world. and our political class are not interested in dealing with this issue, the instinctive reaction among the institutions, which are overwhelmingly dominated by elite graduates, is to basically view that policy as a racist policy, is to view that policy as being inherently problematic. Now, I don't think those taboos are going to last for much longer. I think those taboos are going to be forced open, and I think we're going to, simply through the will of public pressure, I think we're going to have a different conversation in this country about who we are.
So rewind just a little bit what you said. So why not then just say, okay, if the claim is that we're racist, I want to say no more immigrants literally from anywhere.
Well, I would argue, if you said to me, Matt, how do we solve this problem? I would say let's have a 5-year pause on all migration. So let's have a 5-year pause on all migration. Why do I say that? Because we've had a 20-year experiment in this country with mass migration. And at no point have we developed serious policies for integrating newcomers. At no point have we developed a serious political economy that reflects that change. And at no point have we developed a long-term plan for how we're going to deal with public services and housing. So if we did a 5-year freeze and we said, okay, let's just think about who we are as a country, how are we going to manage this, how are we going to absorb this level of change, I actually think it would put us in a much healthier place as a country. It's not to say, I would oppose migration. I don't oppose migration per se, but the pace and the scale of migration that we are now experiencing in Britain is going to undermine and weaken our society. That's the big problem I have with it.
Okay, two things. Undermine and weaken is judged by what metrics, like how, and how'd you come up with 5 years?
Well, firstly, in terms of the effects, I would argue we know from existing research that highly diverse societies tend to have lower levels of social trust. We've had a debate with Robert Putnam and others about that issue, and I think I would argue that evidence is quite compelling. We know that when you have public concerns over migration that are not resolved, you have higher levels of political distrust. So the political system weakens. We know we've got lots of communities that are highly segregated in Britain. We had a big government review recently where Dame Louise Casey pointed out that there were young Muslim children in Britain that thought Britain was 90% Muslim based on the experiences in their local communities, because they're not really getting any integration with wider British society. So the problems, I think, are very visible. We don't talk about them, but I think the problems are visible.
Okay, so let me. Okay, so the problems are lower trust and less trust in political institutions. What if somebody looked at that, and I don't think that the right-left axis is useful here, but what if someone looked at that and said, you know what, I am willing to pay that price to save a Somali, to save a Gazan. I am willing to pay that price to tear apart the fabric of the society to let in 1 million Gazans. It is worth it to save 1 million lives. It's a kind of equity-based argument as well. You've had it for a long time. You should be paying for the sins of colonialism. It's okay to increase taxes on people, etc. I think that's a price worth paying.
I don't think many people think that is a price worth paying, and I think their instinctive response would be, we've already paid that price in terms of helping Hong Kongers, in terms of helping Ukrainian refugees, in terms of helping Afghan interpreter refugees. The story of Britain over the last 20 years has been a story of a country that has been incredibly welcoming and open and has paid its share in the global need to support refugees and people fleeing persecution. I don't think, personally, having open door migration to satisfy the sense of moral righteousness among 5% of the population is going to build a stable, secure society. That's my personal view. So I don't think that's going to be particularly convincing at all. And I do think it's time for us to have a national debate about what kind of migration we want to have. And I don't think
when you say
refer
that
to Gazans and you refer to refugees, from that part of the world. I think personally there are also additional problems that will flow from that kind of migration that, again, I don't think people in Britain are willing to talk about.
So we have a number of problems simultaneously occurring here.
Yeah.
Undergirding those, well, what kind of migration should it have? What's a good number? Should we suspend it for 5 years? What is the logistical pathway in terms of pulling out of pre-existing treaties? How should we do that? I'm always fascinated by the moral question of should we fire on the boats, but we'll bracket that for a second. And then you have another problem, which I would argue is underlying that, is that people are unwilling to have an honest conversation about the problem. And part of that, this is what I'm inferring from what you said, or if I got it wrong, let me know, is that they're afraid to be called a racist. Mm-hmm. They're afraid to be thought of as being on the far right. Correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the consequence of this is they're not willing to have an honest conversation about, for example, grooming gangs, or in Nottingham, or rape rates, or murder rates. I don't understand how, looking at the data, you can perhaps say that an inference from the data in terms of a policy prescription could be perceived as that. But just looking at the data itself is not racist.
Well, I mean, you mentioned the best example of this, which is the organized sexual exploitation of mainly young white working class women in northern towns across the country. Now, this is what we call in Britain the grooming scandal.
Correct.
And it's just worth spending a minute on it because
Sure.
it opens up the light on the taboos.
Sure.
The scandal first came to light in 2011 when a very brave journalist called Andrew Norfolk at the Times started saying he thought there was something going on in northern towns and speculated that this might involve mainly British Muslim Pakistani men who seemed to be working in an organized fashion. There were then a number of investigations throughout the 2010s. I've written extensively on this issue myself.
On your Substack
I've read every report on this. And basically what you saw was collusion by local municipal authorities, police, local councillors, most of those councillors being from the British Muslim community, working together to either suppress information about that scandal or to downplay the significance, to ignore it altogether. And I'm not talking about small numbers here, Peter. In some of these towns, it's now estimated by independent government agencies that more than 1,000 young girls were raped, trafficked. Some had petrol poured over them. Their families were threatened. And so what you saw was a very clannish type of criminal activity, which, to be frank, was linked to the culture of that particular group that comes from a particular part of the world. And the moment people started to talk about it, they were met with this accusation that they were being racist. And I encountered this at the University of Oxford a couple of weeks ago when I mentioned this grooming scandal, and professors on the front row lined up to get the mic and to say, aha, but actually most perpetrators of child sex offences are white. And so what they do is they change the definition of grooming. If you look, obviously, in a country which is still 80 to 85% white British, most child sex offenders are white. But if you look at the specific issue of gang-based grooming, organized grooming of children, it is pretty clear that the evidence is pretty clear that we're mainly talking about British Muslim men of Pakistani heritage. And when I pointed this out, what I saw was the radical progressive reflex to say, well, minorities are the oppressed. The majority is the oppressor. And what's interesting about the grooming scandal is it flips that on its head, because now it's the minority group that is oppressing and preying on children from the majority. And the elite class did not know what to do with that scandal because it violated all of the radical progressive claims. It violated all of the norms. Even now, we cannot talk about that scandal as a country. There has been one television drama based about it. If this had involved any minority group, we would have had an endless national conversation. There'd be monuments, there'd be statues, there'd be all kinds of things to draw attention to it. But to be frank, the treatment of young, white, working class girls is not considered a priority by the elite class.
Okay. This is rather depressing. And in spite of this, people are, or maybe even because of it, we're not having that national conversation. I say we, me temporarily being here, I'm American, but I see that in the United States as well. To what extent do you think not having the national conversation is linked to the, as you say, in the elite class, in academic institutions? And I guess if the grooming scandal didn't do it, an increase in crime didn't do it, and the decrease in social cohesion didn't do it, and the many people who are Jewish legitimately believing that, in fact, right here, and this is a nice neighborhood, you go down and you see the posters ripped down for, missing Israelis. That's not a comment on the Israeli-Palestinian situation. That's just a comment on social cohesion. And many of my friends here who are Jewish are deeply concerned about.
So am I.
Yeah,
And I just,
about
I'll
their
put on
safety.
record, I always will stand with the British Jewish community because it's been outrageous the way they've been treated over the last month since the conflict in Israel. It again shines a light on the elite class that dominates the BBC, the fact that we took weeks to even be willing to describe Hamas as terrorists.
Okay, so my question is, so we have all of these factors that are well documented, and still people don't want to have an honest conversation about it. So what's it going to take?
It's going to take a radical insurgent movement, politician or party, to essentially break open the national conversation. That is essentially where Britain is heading. We are going to, I think, finally realize that neither of the two big parties, the Tories on the right, who are a kind of liberal patrician party, obsessed with status, they would argue if they were here that the things we're talking about are low status, right? That grooming is a low status issue, immigration is not really a priority, the culture wars should not really be stoked. And if we were here with the Labour Party, they would obviously say everything we were talking about was borderline racism or xenophobic. So what I think ultimately Britain is going to have is another grassroots rebellion like Brexit. It's going to be a people's-led movement which is going to force open the national conversation, because we now seem incapable of talking about what is happening to our country and what we're going to leave our children in the future. Because if we don't have a unified story about who we are, if the only story about who we are is that we're a racist country that exploited other people hundreds of years ago, and we should now spend all of our time ignoring all of this bad stuff and talking about diversity and talking about the wonders of multiculturalism. I mean, it was revealing that Suella Braverman was just dumped in British politics. Somebody who openly said multiculturalism was a failure. I mean, this is how much Europe has changed. Okay, 10 years ago, Angela Merkel, Nicolas Sarkozy, and David Cameron in unison all said multiculturalism has failed. What they meant by that was not multicultural society per se has failed. What they meant was that the specific policy of multiculturalism has failed. 10 years on, just a little bit over 10 years on, Suella Braverman says it is visible just by looking at the protests and the demonstrations over the Israel-Gaza conflict, when you have Hamas supporters on the streets of Britain celebrating the atrocities that were committed against Jews. It is obvious multiculturalism as a policy has failed, and she was roundly attacked by pretty much everybody in the elite class. So in 10 years, my point is, we've gone from being at least able to talk about this issue to not being able to talk about it at all.
Do you think the UK is going to fall to Islam?
I don't think it's going to fall to Islam. I think it is going to go through a seismic cultural shift over the next 30 years that people are not remotely ready for. And by that, I mean it is going to experience unprecedented demographic change, including very high levels of migration from non-European countries. It's going to see an increase in the share of the population that is Muslim. It's going to see a threefold increase to about 17-18%. If you look at the Pew Research Center, which is a pretty credible centrist research think tank, that suggests, as I say, by 2040, the Muslim population will be about 18%. It will be higher, by the way, in countries like Sweden and France. We're going to also then see the continued collapse of the birth rate in Britain. We're going to see
a strain on social services.
We're going to see a considerable strain on social services. And I think we're going to see the pressures on things like housing, healthcare, and schools reach levels that we've not really experienced before, which is why, interestingly, Peter, when you talk to young Zoomers today, one of the things that I find actually quite depressing, when you talk to young Zoomers, as I do often at university and elsewhere, and I say, what are you going to do when you grow up? What strikes me now is how many of them say, leave Britain. They sense, not just for reasons to do with housing and the economy, but I think they can now sense that actually this is a country that is now in rapid decline, that doesn't know what it is, what it believes, and doesn't know where it's going, or what they would call the Great Retreat. Yeah. The idea that, you know what, if I can get a laptop and I can go and work in Portugal, or I can go and work in Spain, and I can be a digital native, why not, right? Why wouldn't I do that? And we're not, again, that's another issue we're not even talking about. We're not renewing our national story because we don't even know what our national story is anymore.
Yeah, so I would truly love, I'm going to be back in January, I would love to drill down on some of these issues in January if you're around. I find it fascinating both on the level of policy and on just thinking about why people are not talking about something so central to the political or to their identity. I find that to be fascinating. So,
well, I'll accept your offer, but I'll increase it and say when you're back in January, what we'll do is we'll actually go into some of the non-London communities, some of the most segregated communities in the country, and you can see the migration story with your own eyes, and you can see how it's changing communities.
And I'd love to talk to those people. We'll do Spectrum Street epistemology with them.
But my last point here, which is something I really do believe, this country, you've been here for a while now, you might have picked up on it. But this country is fundamentally lost. And we have a political class, a ruling class that is dangerously out of touch with millions of people out there, outside of the big cities and outside of the university towns. Brexit was supposed to solve that. It was supposed to bring people back together, and it's done the opposite. So the political rebellion that we've seen in Britain, I don't think for a second it's over. There we go.
Well, Matt, thank you so much. That was sobering.
Great. Good luck with the rest of your trip.
Well, thanks. Where can people find you?
Twitter, Substack, they'll find me quite easily. But as I say, I like to write about these issues in a countercultural way because I think we need to increase the health of our national conversation.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you for watching. Everything we do is under the umbrella of the National Progress Alliance, nationalprogressalliance.org. It's a nonprofit, independent 501c3. Your generous donations keep us going and keep fueling content like this. So please help us out. Make a donation. We very much appreciate it. Thank you.